Imagine the silence of the early morning, August 31st, 1939. In Europe, peace still reigns, but it's a peace that has already been bought and sold in backroom diplomatic deals. Just a week prior, an event in Moscow sent shockwaves across the globe. Two arch-enemies, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, signed a non-aggression pact. But hidden in the secret protocols of that document was a ticking time bomb, a map for the partition of Eastern Europe. Hitler knew he finally had a free hand. He didn't have to fear a two-front war, at least not yet. And as the first rays of sun hit the Polish border on September 1st, the guns of the battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire. The world, as the interwar generation knew it, ceased to exist. The bloodiest massacre in human history had begun, and today we're walking through its first, darkest pages. It's important to understand that back in 1939, nobody expected what was coming next. Poland had one of the largest armies in Europe, but they were hit by what would later be called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. This wasn't just an offensive, it was a whole new philosophy of combat. Instead of the slow, methodical crawl of infantry, the Germans hammered forward with armored fists, panzer divisions supported by Stuka dive bombers. Polish forces, despite their heroic resistance, were sliced to ribbons, communications were paralyzed, and the rear lines were pulverized. When the Red Army crossed the border from the east on September 17th, the country's fate was sealed. Poland vanished from the map, carved up between two totalitarian giants. But what were the great democracies doing at this time? France and Britain declared war, yes, but then came the period history calls the phony war. Picture millions of soldiers sitting in trenches along the border, staring at each other through scopes, but never pulling the trigger. The French placed their absolute faith in the Maginot Line, a supposedly invincible chain of concrete and steel forts. They expected a repeat of World War I, static, long, and exhausting. Britain was shipping troops to the continent, but nobody wanted to make the first move. It was a time of missed opportunities. Hitler, meanwhile, wasn't idle. His generals were busy analyzing the Polish campaign, fixing their mistakes and prepping a strike that would shock the planet. In the spring of 1940, the silence broke. First, Denmark and Norway fell. Hitler needed control of the northern seas and the flow of Swedish iron ore. But the real thunderbolt hit on May 10th, when the German war machines slammed into France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The myth of the Maginot Line collapsed in days. The Germans simply bypassed it through the Ardennes forest, a region the French High Command thought was impassable for tanks. It was a strategic masterpiece and a total disaster for the Allies. Hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were pinned against the sea at Dunkirk. The world held its breath. It looked like the British army was about to be annihilated. But then came the miracle of Dunkirk, the mobilization of hundreds of civilian vessels, from fishing boats to private yachts, rescuing over 300,000 soldiers. They left their gear behind, but they kept their lives.
France fell incredibly fast. On June 22, 1940, in the very same railcar in Compiègne, where Germany had admitted defeat in 1918, an armistice was signed. Hitler was now the master of Europe. Britain stood alone. Winston Churchill, who had replaced Neville Chamberlain, gave his famous speech about fighting on the beaches, in the fields, and in the streets. The Battle of Britain began, the first conflict in history fought entirely in the air. The Luftwaffe tried to wipe out the RAF and break the people's spirit with massive bombings of London and other cities. But British pilots in Spitfires and Hurricanes, using a new technology called radar, held the line. For the first time, Hitler was forced to postpone his invasion plans. He realized Britain wouldn't be brought to its knees that easily. And it was right here, at the end of 1940, that Hitler made the decision that would be the beginning of his end. He decided to turn east. Britain wasn't defeated, but he believed that by crushing the Soviet Union, he would rob the English of their last hope for an ally in Europe. The prep for Operation Barbarossa was kept in total secrecy. Hitler viewed the USSR as a colossus on clay feet. He planned to finish the war in a few months before winter. Stalin, on the other hand, ignored dozens of warnings from his intelligence. He simply didn't believe Germany would risk a two-front war. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. The silence across the massive front from the Baltic to the Black Sea exploded with the roar of thousands of guns. It was the largest invasion in history. 3 army groups, North, Center, and South, surged into Soviet territory.
The first few weeks were a catastrophe for the Red Army. Thousands of planes were destroyed on the ground, and entire divisions were trapped in pockets and taken prisoner. It looked like the fall of France all over again. Minsk, Kiev, and Smolensk fell. The Germans were clawing toward Moscow. But here, the Nazi machine hit something it hadn't seen in Europe: total resistance. Every city became a fortress. By the fall of 41, the momentum began to fade. The Rasputitsa, the mud season, turned roads into bottomless bogs, and German logistics, stretched over thousands of miles, began to snap. When the frosts hit in November, it turned out German soldiers had no winter gear, and their engines wouldn't start in sub-zero temps. In December 1941, the impossible happened. At the very gates of Moscow, the Red Army under Georgy Zhukov launched a counteroffensive. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was dead. Hitler had to face the fact: there would be no quick war. While the fate of Europe was being decided in Russia, another crisis was boiling on the other side of the world. Japan, seeking dominance in Asia, saw the US as their main obstacle. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier planes launched a devastating strike on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. That event changed history. The United States, which had clung to isolationism, jumped into the war instantly. Hitler, honoring his alliance with Japan, also declared war on the US. It was an act of pure insanity. Now Germany was up against the three greatest powers on Earth: Britain and its navy, the USSR and its endless manpower, and the US with its terrifying industrial might.
1942 was a year of testing and finding a foothold. In the Pacific, the Americans halted the Japanese advance at the Battle of Midway, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. That was the turning point. The initiative shifted to the US. In North Africa, British forces under Montgomery defeated the Desert Fox Erwin Rommel at El Alamein. Hitler's dreams of seizing the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil were crushed. But the main events were still happening on the Eastern Front. Hitler knew he needed the oil of the Caucasus to keep the war going. In the summer of 42, the Germans launched a massive new offensive in the south. The target was Stalingrad, a city on the Volga named after the Soviet leader. Taking it would mean cutting a vital transport artery and opening the road to Baku. The Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol of human endurance and horror. The fight was for every house, every floor, every pile of rubble. The city was ground into ruins, but it wouldn't surrender. Meanwhile, the Soviet command was prepping Operation Uranus. While elite German units were bogged down in street fights, Soviet forces were building up on the flanks, which were held by Germany's less capable allies, the Romanians and Hungarians. On November 19, 1942, Soviet artillery signaled the start of the counterstrike. Within days, the German Sixth Army under Pallas, the best the Wehrmacht had, was completely surrounded. Hitler forbade Pallas from breaking out, promising an air supply that turned out to be impossible. January 1943 brought the end of the drama. The Battle of Stalingrad ended with the total surrender of the remaining German troops. It was a shock to the heart of Germany. The country declared 3 days of national mourning. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front began its slow, relentless shift to the Soviet Union. Hitler was no longer calling the shots. His enemies were. It's crucial to note that 1943 was when the Allied steel conveyor hit full speed. American factories were pumping out thousands of tanks and planes. Lend-Lease flooded Soviet units with trucks, food, and radios. Allied bombers began to dominate the skies over Germany. Hitler tried one last time to take back the initiative in the summer of 43 at the Kursk Bulge. It was the largest tank battle in history. The Germans threw their new Tiger and Panther tanks into the meat grinder, hoping for a tech advantage. But the layered Soviet defense held firm. After Kursk, the German army began its long, long retreat. By mid-1943, the face of the war had changed. Resistance in occupied Europe grew every day. In Italy, the Allies landed in Sicily, leading to the fall of Mussolini. Germany was forced to occupy Italy just to prevent a total collapse on the southern front. The Reich had truly become a fortress, but it was a fortress being attacked from every single side.
So we left off in mid-1943, a moment where the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen after the fall of Stalingrad and the collapse of Hitler's hopes at the Kursk Bulge. But to truly understand why 1943 became the year of the turning point, we have to step away from the battlefields of Russia for a moment and move to the cold, gray waters of the Atlantic. Here, in the deep ocean, the fate of more than just a few divisions was being decided. We're talking about the very survival of Great Britain and the ability of the United States to funnel its massive resources into Europe. This part of the war often sits in the shadow of the great land battles, but believe me, without a victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, the D-Day landings in Normandy would have been an impossible dream. Since 1940, German U-boats, Admiral Donitz's infamous Grey Wolves, had been literally suffocating Britain. They used wolf pack tactics, stalking convoys at night and attacking on the surface, making them nearly invisible to the radars of the time. By early 1942, the situation for the Allies had turned critical. The tonnage of sunken ships was growing exponentially. Hitler believed that if he could sink ships faster than the Americans could build them, Britain would be forced out of the war by starvation and a lack of fuel. But during 1942 and 1943, a quiet technical revolution took place. The Allies began using new sonar, long-range anti-submarine aircraft, and most importantly, they cracked the German Enigma code. Bletchley Park and a team of mathematicians led by Alan Turing gave the admirals an ace that Hitler didn't even know existed. Suddenly, the British knew where the U-boats were before they even moved into position. By May 1943, Dönitz was forced to pull his boats out of the North Atlantic. He had lost too many veterans. The ocean was no longer a German lake. This was a victory of logistics and intelligence over raw, brutal force. At the same time, on the other side of the world in the Pacific, the war took on a completely different character. If Europe was a war of tanks and artillery, the Pacific was a war of aircraft carriers and Marines. After the shock of Pearl Harbor, the American machine began to slowly but surely pick up speed. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 stripped Japan of its best pilots and 4 heavy carriers. From that moment on, the Imperial Japanese Navy was forced onto the defensive, but that defense was fanatical. The Guadalcanal campaign, which lasted 6 months, showed the world the true horror of jungle warfare. It was a war of attrition where malaria and dysentery killed just as many men as bullets did. By February 1943, the Americans had finally secured the island. This marked the start of their island hopping strategy. They didn't try to capture every single piece of land. They took key airfields, leaving Japanese garrisons on other islands to wither away without supplies. Let's head back to Europe, but this time let's see it through the eyes of an ordinary person in the occupied territories during 42 and 43. This was when Hitler's New Order showed its true face. The Holocaust, which began as discrimination, evolved into the industrial-scale murder of millions in death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. Hitler was building his empire on slave labor. Millions of Ostarbeiters, workers from the East, were herded into Germany to work in Krupp factories and the Reichswehr. But this cruelty sparked a massive resistance movement. The French Maquis, Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia, Soviet partisan units in the forests of Belarus, they all turned the German rear into a living hell. Railroads were blown up, supply trains were derailed, and German soldiers were terrified to wander even a mile from their garrisons. By 1943, Hitler was forced to keep dozens of divisions in the rear just to guard his supply lines, divisions that were desperately needed at Stalingrad or Kursk.
Now, let's look deep behind the front lines, because the war from 1941 to 1943 was above all else a war of factories. It was a showdown between Detroit, Magnitogorsk, and the Ruhr. By 1943, the Allied advantage had become overwhelming. In the Soviet Union, a true industrial miracle took place. Thousands of factories, evacuated in 1941 to the Ural Mountains, began pumping out equipment at an unthinkable rate, often from unfinished plants in the middle of winter. The T-34 tank became the icon of this era, simple, effective, and mass-produced. Meanwhile, American industry was doing the impossible. The U.S. was launching a Liberty ship every few days. They flooded their allies with trucks, planes, and radios. Germany, despite the talent of its armaments minister Albert Speer, simply couldn't compete with the resources of 2 continents. Hitler demanded quality, complex tigers and panthers that were powerful but expensive and prone to breaking down. The Allies, on the other hand, bet on quantity. For every 1 German tank, there were 5 or 10 Soviet or American ones. The math of war was working relentlessly against Berlin. 1943 was also the year the leaders of the Big Three, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, began to truly coordinate. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, a historic decision was made. The war would be fought until the unconditional surrender of Germany. No separate peace, no draw. This meant the Nazi leadership had no way out. Hitler realized this was a war of total annihilation, and he responded by declaring total war. But the enthusiasm in Germany was already fading. After the defeats in Africa and Stalingrad, the letters coming home from the front were getting darker and darker. In North Africa, by May 1943, it was all over. The Tunisia campaign ended with the capture of over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers. It was Stalingrad in the sand. The Africa Corps, Hitler's pride, ceased to exist. And immediately after that, the blow landed in the soft underbelly of Europe. In July 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. Operation Husky was the largest naval invasion the world had seen up to that point. It led to the downfall of Benito Mussolini. His own Grand Council voted against him, and the Duce was arrested. Italy, Hitler's first ally, began looking for a way out of the war. For Hitler, this was a nightmare. He had to rush troops from Russia to occupy Italy just to keep the Allies away from the Reich's borders. This drain on his forces was one of the main reasons the German offensive at Kursk stalled so quickly. By the fall of 1943, the map of the war was unrecognizable compared to 1941. In the east, the Red Army liberated Kiev and reached the Dnieper River. The Battle of the Dnieper was one of the bloodiest. Crossing a massive river under heavy fire required incredible courage, but Soviet troops secured their bridgeheads. The German Eastern Wall, which Hitler had put so much faith in, was breached. At the same time in the West, American and British bombers began systematically leveling German cities. The 1943 bombings of Hamburg showed the world the horror of the firestorm. Hitler screamed for revenge, but his Luftwaffe could no longer protect the German sky. All his best pilots were dying in Russia or over the Mediterranean.
As we wrap up this stage of our journey, it's vital to emphasize, by the end of 1943, the outcome of the war was effectively decided. The Tehran Conference in late 1943 sealed the deal. Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met in person for the first time. They made the final decision to invade France in the spring of 1944, creating that second front Stalin had been demanding for 2 years. Hitler knew the noose was tightening. His strategy now boiled down to one word: hold. Hold on in the hope that the Allies would have a falling out, or that some impossible miracle weapon would change everything. But miracles don't happen when the entire economic and human power of the planet is working against you. The period from 1939 to 1943 is the path from the blinding triumph of Blitzkrieg to the realization that Germany was caught in a trap it had built for itself. It was an era where the heroism of individuals in 1941 grew into the organized power of millions by 1943. The war would drag on for another year and a half. It would claim millions more lives. Berlin would still be standing, and the Japanese islands would remain out of reach for a while longer. But by December 1943, every clear-thinking person in the headquarters of Berlin, Tokyo, and Rome already knew the time for the Axis had run out. The world had entered the final stage of the greatest conflict in history, where the question "who will win" was replaced by "when" and at what cost.